Appearance and Reality, a short story by Somerset Maugham. I do not vouch for the truth of this story, but it was told me by a professor of French literature at an English university, and he was a man of too high a character, I think, to have told it to me unless it were true. His practice was to draw the attention of his students to three French writers who, in his opinion, combined the qualities that are the mainsprings of the French character. By reading them, he said, you could learn so much about the French people that if he had the power, he would not trust such of our rulers as have to deal with the French nation to enter upon their offices till they had passed a pretty stiff examination on their works. They are Rabelais, with his Gauloiserie, which may be described as the ribaldry that likes to call a spade something more than a bloody shovel, La Fontaine, with his bon sens, which is just horse sense, and finally Corneille, with his panache. This is translated in the dictionaries as the plume the knight-at-arms wore on his helmet, but metaphorically it seems to signify dignity and bravado, display and heroism, vainglory and pride. It was le panache that made the French gentlemen at Fontenoy say to the officers of King George II, "Fire first, gentlemen." It was le panache that wrung from Cambronne's bawdy lips at Waterloo the phrase, "The Guard dies but never surrenders." And it is le panache that urges an indigent French poet, awarded the Nobel Prize, with a splendid gesture to give it all away. My professor was not a frivolous man, and to his mind the story I am about to tell brought out so distinctly the three master qualities of the French that it had a high educational value. I have called it Appearance and Reality. This is the title of what I suppose may be looked upon as the most important philosophical work that my country, right or wrong, produced in the 19th century. It is stiff but stimulating reading. It is written in excellent English, with considerable humour, and even though the lay reader is unlikely to follow with understanding some of its very subtle arguments, he has nevertheless the thrilling sensation of walking a spiritual tightrope over a metaphysical abyss, and he ends the book with a comfortable feeling that nothing matters a hang anyway. There is no excuse for my making use of the title of so celebrated a book, except that it so admirably suits my story. Though Lizette was a philosopher only in the sense in which we are all philosophers, that she exercised thought in dealing with the problems of existence, her feeling for reality was so strong, and her sympathy for appearance so genuine, that she might almost claim to have established that reconciliation of irreconcilables at which the philosophers have for so many centuries been aiming. Lizette was French, and she passed several hours of every working day dressing and undressing herself at one of the most expensive and fashionable establishments in Paris. A pleasant occupation for a young woman who was well aware that she had a lovely figure. She was in short a mannequin. She was tall enough to be able to wear a train with elegance, and her hips were so slim that in sports clothes she could bring the scent of heather to your nostrils. Her long legs enabled her to wear pyjamas with distinction, and her slim waist, her little breasts, made the simplest bathing dress a ravishment. She could wear anything. She had a way of huddling herself in a chinchilla coat that made the most sensible persons admit that chinchilla was worth all the money it cost. Fat women, gross women, stumpy women, bony women, shapeless women, old women, plain women, sat in the spacious armchairs, and because Lizette looked so sweet, bought the clothes that so admirably suited her. She had large brown eyes, a large red mouth, and a very clear but slightly freckled skin. It was difficult for her to preserve that haughty, sullen, and coldly indifferent demeanour that appears to be essential to the mannequin. As she sails in with deliberate steps, turns round slowly, and, with an air of contempt for the universe equalled only by the camels, sails out. There was the suspicion of a twinkle in Lizette's large brown eyes, and her red lips seemed to tremble, as though on the smallest provocation they would break into a smile. It was the twinkle that attracted the attention of Monsieur Raymond Le Sueur. He was sitting in a spurious Louis XVI chair by the side of his wife, in another, who had induced him to come with her to see the private view of the spring fashions. This was a proof of Monsieur Le Sueur's amiable disposition, for he was an extremely busy man who, one would have thought, had many more important things to do than to sit for an hour and watch a dozen beautiful young women parade themselves in a bewildering variety of costumes. He could not have thought that any of them could possibly make his wife other than she was, and she was a tall, angular woman of 50, with features considerably larger than life-size. He had not indeed married her for her looks, and she had never, even in the first delirious days of their honeymoon, imagined that he had. He had married her in order to combine the flourishing steel works, of which she was the heiress, with his equally flourishing manufactory of locomotives. The marriage had been a success. She had provided him with a son who could play tennis nearly as well as a professional, dance quite as well as a gigolo, and hold his own at bridge with any of the experts, and a daughter whom he had been able to dower sufficiently to marry to a very nearly authentic prince. He had reason to be proud of his children. By perseverance and a reasonable integrity, he had prospered sufficiently to gain the controlling interest in a sugar refinery, a movie company, a firm that built motor cars, and a newspaper. And finally, he had been able to spend enough money to persuade the free and independent electorate of a certain district to send him to the Senate. He was a man of a dignified presence, a pleasing corpulence and a sanguine complexion, with a neat grey beard cut square, a bald head and a roll of fat at the back of his neck. You had no need to look at the red button that adorned his black coat to surmise that he was a person of consequence. He was a man who made up his mind quickly, and when his wife left the dressmaker's to go and play bridge, he parted from her, saying that for the sake of exercise he would walk to the Senate, where his duty to his country called him. He did not, however, go as far as this, but contented himself with taking his exercise up and down a back street, into which he rightly surmised the young ladies of the dressmaker's establishment would emerge at the close of business hours. He had barely waited for a quarter of an hour when the appearance of a number of women in groups, some young and pretty, some not so young and far from pretty, apprised him that the moment for which he had been waiting was come, and in 2 or 3 minutes Lizette tripped into the street. The senator was well aware that his appearance and his age made it unlikely that young women would find him attractive at first sight, but he had found that his wealth and his position counterbalanced these disadvantages. Lizette had a companion with her, which would possibly have embarrassed a man of less importance, but did not cause the senator to hesitate for an instant. He went up to her, raising his hat politely, but not so much as to show how bald he was, and bade her good evening. "Bonsoir, mademoiselle," he said with an ingratiating smile. She gave him the shortest possible look, and her full red lips, just trembling with a smile, stiffened. She turned her head away, and breaking into conversation with her friend, walked on with a very good assumption of supreme indifference. Far from disconcerted, the senator turned round and followed the two girls at a distance of a few yards. They walked along the little back street, turned into the boulevard, and at the Place de la Madeleine took a bus. The senator was well satisfied. He had drawn a number of correct conclusions. The fact that she was obviously going home with a girlfriend proved that she had no accredited admirer. The fact that she had turned away when he had accosted her showed that she was discreet and modest and well-behaved, which he liked young women to be when they were pretty, and her coat and skirt, the plain black hat and the rayon stockings proclaimed that she was poor and therefore virtuous. In those clothes she looked just as attractive as in the splendid garments he had seen her wearing before. He had a funny little feeling in his heart. He had not had that peculiar sensation, pleasurable and yet oddly painful, for several years, but he recognized it at once. "It's love by blue," he muttered. He had never expected to feel it again, and squaring his shoulders he walked on with a confident step. He walked to the offices of a private detective and there left instructions that inquiries should be made about a young person called Lizette, who worked as a mannequin at such and such an address. And then, remembering that at the Senate they were discussing the American debt, took a cab to the impressive building, entered the library, where there was an armchair he very much liked, and had a pleasant nap. The information he had asked for reached him 3 days later. It was cheap at the price. Mademoiselle Lizette Larion lived with a widowed aunt in a 2-room apartment in the district of Paris, known as the Batignolles. Her father, a wounded hero of the Great War, had a bureau de tabac in a small country town in the southwest of France. The rent of the flat was 2,000 francs. She led a regular life, but was fond of going to the pictures, was not known to have a lover, and was 19 years old. She was well spoken of by the concierge of the apartments, and well liked by her companions at the shop. Obviously she was a very respectable young woman, and the senator could not but think that she was eminently suited to solace the leisure moments of a man who wanted relaxation from the cares of state and the exacting pressure of big business. It is unnecessary to relate in detail the steps that Monsieur Le Sueur took to achieve the end he had in view. He was too important and too busy to occupy himself with the matter personally, but he had a confidential secretary who was very clever at dealing with electors who had not made up their minds how to vote, and who certainly knew how to put before a young woman who was honest, but poor, the advantages that might ensue if she were lucky enough to secure the friendship of such a man as his employer. The confidential secretary paid the widowed aunt, Madame Saladin by name, a visit, and told her that Monsieur Le Sueur, always abreast of the time, had lately begun to take an interest in films and was indeed about to engage in the production of a picture. This shows how much a clever brain can make use of a fact that an ordinary person would have passed over as insignificant. Monsieur Le Sueur had been struck by the appearance of Mademoiselle Lizette at the dressmaker's and the brilliant way she wore her clothes, and it had occurred to him that she might very well suit a part he had it in mind for her to play. Like all intelligent people, the senator always stuck as close to the truth as he could. The confidential secretary then invited Madame Saladin and her niece to a dinner, where they could make one another's further acquaintance, and the senator could judge whether Mademoiselle Lizette had the aptitude for the screen that he suspected. Madame Saladin said she would ask her niece, but for her part seemed to think the suggestion quite reasonable. When Madame Saladin put the proposition before Lizette and explained the rank, dignity, and importance of their generous host, that young person shrugged her pretty shoulders disdainfully. "Cette vieille carpe," she said, of which the not quite literal translation is, "that old trout." "What does it matter if he's an old trout if he gives you a part?" said Madame Saladin. "Et ta sœur," said Lizette. This phrase, which of course means, "and your sister," and sounds harmless enough and even pointless, is a trifle vulgar and is used by well-brought-up young women, I think, only if they want to shock. It expresses the most forcible unbelief, and the only correct translation into the vernacular is too coarse for my chaste pen. "Anyhow, we should get a slap-up dinner," said Madame Saladin. "After all, you're not a child anymore." Where did he say we should dine? "The Château de Madrid. Everyone knows it's the most expensive restaurant in the world." There is no reason why it should not be. The food is very good, the cellar is famous, and its situation makes it on a fine evening of early summer an enchanting place to eat at. A very pretty dimple appeared on Lizette's cheek, and a smile on her large red mouth. She had perfect teeth. "I can borrow a dress from the shop," she murmured. A few days later the senator's confidential secretary fetched them in a taxi and drove Madame Saladin and her engaging niece to the Bois de Boulogne. Lizette looked ravishing in one of the firm's most successful models, and Madame Saladin extremely respectable in her own black satin and a hat that Lizette had made for the occasion. The secretary introduced the ladies to Monsieur Le Sueur, who greeted them with the benign dignity of the politician who is behaving graciously to the wife and daughter of a valued constituent. And this is exactly what he, in his astute way, he thought people at adjacent tables who knew him would imagine his guests to be. The dinner passed off very agreeably, and less than a month later, Lizette moved into a charming little flat, at a convenient distance, both from her place of business and from the Senate. It was decorated in the modern style by a fashionable upholsterer. Monsieur Le Sueur wished Lizette to continue to work. It suited him very well that she should have something to do during the hours that he was obliged to devote to affairs, for it would keep her out of mischief, and he very well knew that a woman who has nothing to do all day spends much more money than one who has an occupation. An intelligent man thinks of these things. But extravagance was a vice to which Lizette was strange. The senator was fond and generous. It was a source of satisfaction to him that Lizette began very soon to save money. She ran her apartment with thrift and bought her clothes at trade prices, and every month sent a certain sum home to her heroic father, who purchased little plots of land with it. She continued to lead a quiet and modest life, and Monsieur Le Sueur was pleased to learn from the concierge, who had a son she wanted to place in a government office, that Lizette's only visitors were her aunt and one or two girls from the shop. The senator had never been happier in his life. It was very satisfactory to him to think that even in this world a good action had its reward, For was it not from pure kindness that he had accompanied his wife to the dressmaker's on that afternoon when they were discussing the American debt at the Senate, and thus seen for the first time the charming Lizette? The more he knew her, the more he doted on her. She was a delightful companion. She was gay and debonair. Her intelligence was respectable, and she could listen cleverly when he discussed business matters or affairs of state with her. She rested him when he was weary and cheered him when he was depressed. She was glad to see him when he came, and he came frequently, generally from 5 till 7, and sorry when he went away. She gave him the impression that he was not only her lover, but her friend. Sometimes they dined together in her apartment, and the well-appointed meal, the genial comfort, gave him a keen appreciation of the charm of domesticity. His friends told the senator he looked 20 years younger. He felt it. He was conscious of his good fortune. He could not but feel, however, that after a life of honest toil and public service, it was only his due. It was thus a shock to him, after things had been proceeding so happily for nearly 2 years, on coming back to Paris early one Sunday morning, unexpectedly after a visit to his constituency, which was to last over the weekend, when he let himself into the apartment with his latchkey, thinking since it was the day of rest to find Lizette in bed, to discover her having breakfast in her bedroom tête-à-tête with a young gentleman he had never seen before who was wearing his, the senator's, brand-new pyjamas. Lizette was surprised to see him. Indeed, she gave a distinct start. "Tiens," she said, "where have you sprung from? I didn't expect you till tomorrow." "The ministry has fallen," he answered mechanically. "I have been sent for. I am to be offered the Ministry of the Interior." But that was not what he wanted to say at all. He gave the gentleman who was wearing his pyjamas a furious look. "Who is that young man?" he cried. Lizette's large red mouth broke into a most alluring smile. "My lover," she answered. "Do you think I'm a fool?" shouted the senator. "I know he's your lover." "Why do you ask, then?" Monsieur Le Sueur was a man of action. He went straight up to Lizette and smacked her hard on her right cheek with his left hand, and then smacked her hard on the left cheek with his right hand. "Brute!" screamed Lizette. He turned to the young man, who had watched this scene of violence with some embarrassment, and drawing himself to his full height, flung out his arm, and with a dramatic finger pointed to the door. "Get out!" he cried. "Get out!" One would have thought, such was the commanding aspect of a man who was accustomed to sway a crowd of angry taxpayers, and who could dominate with his frown an annual meeting of disappointed shareholders, that the young man would have made a bolt for the door. But he stood his ground, irresolutely it is true, but he stood his ground. He gave Lizette an appealing look and slightly shrugged his shoulders. "What are you waiting for?" shouted the senator. "Do you want me to use force?" "He can't go out in his pyjamas," said Lizette. "They're not his pyjamas, they're my pyjamas. He's waiting for his clothes." Monsieur Le Sueur looked round, and on the chair behind him, flung down in a disorderly fashion, was a variety of masculine garments. The senator gave the young man a look of contempt. "You may take your clothes, monsieur," he said with cold disdain. The young man picked them up in his arms, gathered up the shoes that were lying about the floor, and quickly left the room. Monsieur Le Sueur had a considerable gift of oratory. Never had he made better use of it than now. He told Lizette what he thought of her. It was not flattering. He painted her ingratitude in the blackest colours. He ransacked an extensive vocabulary in order to find opprobrious names to call her. He called all the powers of heaven to witness that never had a woman repaid with such gross deception an honest man's belief in her. In short, he said everything that anger, wounded vanity, and disappointment suggested to him. Lizette did not seek to defend herself. She listened in silence, looking down and mechanically crumbling the roll which the senator's appearance had prevented her from finishing. He flung an irritated glance at her plate. "I was so anxious that you should be the first to hear my great news that I came straight here from the station. I was expecting to have my petit déjeuner with you, sitting at the end of your bed." "My poor dear, haven't you had your breakfast? I'll order some for you at once." "I don't want any." "Nonsense! With the great responsibility you are about to assume, you must keep up your strength." She rang, and when the maid came, told her to bring in hot coffee. It was brought, and Lizette poured it out. He would not touch it. She buttered a roll. He shrugged his shoulders and began to eat, Meanwhile, he uttered a few remarks on the perfidy of women. She remained silent. "At all events, it is something," he said, "that you have not the effrontery to attempt to excuse yourself. You know that I am not a man who can be ill-used with impunity. The soul of generosity when people behave well to me, I am pitiless when they behave badly. The very moment I have drunk my coffee, I shall leave this apartment forever." Lizette sighed. "I will tell you now that I had prepared a surprise for you. I had made up my mind to celebrate the 2nd anniversary of our union by settling a sum of money on you sufficient to give you a modest independence if anything happened to me." "How much?" asked Lizette somberly. "1,000,000 francs." She sighed again. Suddenly something soft hit the senator on the back of the head, and he gave a start. "What is that?" he cried. "He's returning your pajamas!" The young man had opened the door, flung the pajamas at the senator's head, and quickly closed it again. The senator disengaged himself from the silk trousers that clung round his neck. "What a way to return them! It is obvious that your friend has no education." "Of course he has not your distinction," murmured Lizette. "And has he my intelligence?" "Oh no." "Is he rich?" "Penniless." "Then, name of a name. What is it you see in him?" "He's young," smiled Lizette. The senator looked down at his plate, and a tear rose in his eyes and rolled down his cheek into the coffee. Lizette gave him a kindly look. "My poor friend, one can't have everything in this life," she said. "I knew I was not young, but my situation, my fortune, my vitality, I thought it made up. There are women who only like men of a certain age. There are celebrated actresses who look upon it as an honor to be the little friend of a minister. I am too well brought up to throw your origins in your face, but the fact remains that you are a mannequin, and I took you out of an apartment of which the rent is only 2,000 francs a year. It was a step up for you. The daughter of poor but honest parents, I have no reason to be ashamed of my origins. And it is not because I have earned my living in a humble sphere that you have the right to reproach me. Do you love this boy? Yes? And not me? You too. I love you both, but I love you differently. I love you because you are so distinguished, and your conversation is instructive and interesting. I love you because you are kind and generous. I love him because his eyes are so big and his hair waves and he dances divinely. It's very natural. You know that in my position I cannot take you to places where they dance, and I dare say when he's as old as I am, he'll have no more hair than I have. That may well be true, Lizette agreed, but she did not think it much mattered. What will your aunt, the respectable Madame Saladin, say to you when she hears what you have done? It will not be exactly a surprise to her. Do you mean to say that worthy woman countenances your conduct? O tempora, o mores! How long then has this been going on? Since I first went to the shop. He travels for a big silk firm in Lyons. He came in one day with his samples. We liked the look of one another. But your aunt was there to defend you from the temptations to which a young girl is exposed in Paris. She should never have allowed you to have anything to do with this young man. I did not ask her permission. It is enough to bring the grey hairs of your poor father to the grave. Had you no thought of that wounded hero whose services to his country have been rewarded with a license to sell tobacco? Do you forget that, as Minister of the Interior, the department is under my control? I should be within my rights if I revoked the license on account of your flagrant immorality. I know you are too great a gentleman to do a dastardly thing like that. He waved his hand in an impressive, though perhaps too dramatic a manner. Don't be afraid. I will never stoop so low as to revenge myself on one who has deserved well of his country for the misdeeds of a creature my sense of dignity forces me to despise. He went on with his interrupted breakfast. Lizette did not speak, and there was silence between them. But his appetite satisfied, his mood changed. He began to feel sorry for himself rather than angry with her, and with a strange ignorance of woman's heart, he thought to arouse Lizette's remorse by exhibiting himself as an object of pity. It is hard to break a habit to which one has grown accustomed. It was a relief and a solace to me to come here when I could snatch a moment from my many occupations. Will you regret me a little, Lizette? Of course. He gave a deep sigh. I should never have thought you capable of so much deception. It is the deception that rankles. she murmured thoughtfully. Men are funny in that way. They cannot forgive being made fools of. It is because they are so vain. They attach importance to things that are of no consequence. Do you call it a matter of no consequence that I should find you having breakfast with a young man wearing my pajamas? If he were my husband and you were my lover, you would think it perfectly natural. Obviously, for then I should be deceiving him and my honor would be secure. In short, I have only to marry him to make the situation perfectly regular. For a moment he did not understand. Then her meaning flashed across his clever brain, and he gave her a quick look. Her lovely eyes had the twinkle he always found so alluring, and on her large red mouth was the suspicion of a roguish smile. Do not forget that as a member of the Senate, I am by all the traditions of the Republic the authorized mainstay of morality and good behavior. Does that weigh very heavily with you? He stroked his handsome square beard with a composed and dignified gesture. Not a row of beans, he replied, but the expression he used had a Gallic breadth that would perhaps have given his more conservative supporters something of a shock. Would he marry you? He asked. He adores me. Of course he would marry me. If I told him I had a dot of 1,000,000 francs, he would ask nothing better. Monsieur Le Sueur gave her another look. When in a moment of anger, he told her it had been his intention to settle 1,000,000 francs on her, he had exaggerated a good deal in the desire to make her see how much her treachery was costing her. But he was not the man to draw back when his dignity was concerned. It is much more than a young man in his position of life could aspire to. But if he adores you, he would be always at your side. Didn't I tell you that he was a commercial traveller? He can only come to Paris for the weekend. That, of course, is a horse of another colour, said the senator. It would naturally be a satisfaction to him to know that during his absence I should be there to keep an eye on you. A considerable satisfaction, said Lizette. To facilitate the conversation, she rose from her seat and made herself comfortable on the senator's knees. He pressed her hand tenderly. I am very fond of you, Lizette, he said. I should not like you to make a mistake. Are you sure he will make you happy? I think so. I will have proper inquiries made. I would never consent to your marrying anyone not of exemplary character and unimpeachable morality. For all our sakes, we must make quite sure about this young man whom we are preparing to bring into our lives. Lizette raised no objection. She was aware that the senator liked to do things with order and method. He now prepared to leave her. He wanted to break his important news to Madame Le Sueur, and he had to get in touch with various persons in the parliamentary group to which he belonged. There is only one more thing, he said, as he bowed Lizette an affectionate farewell. If you marry, I must insist on your giving up your work. The place of a wife is the home, and it is against all my principles that a married woman should take the bread out of a man's mouth. Lizette reflected that a strapping young man would look rather funny walking round the room, with his hips swaying, to show off the latest models, but she respected the senator's principles. It shall be as you wish, darling, she said. The inquiries he made were satisfactory, and the marriage took place on a Saturday morning as soon as the legal formalities were completed. Monsieur Le Sueur, Minister of the Interior, and Madame Saladin were witnesses. The bridegroom was a slim young man with a straight nose, fine eyes, and black waving hair brushed straight back from his forehead. He looked more like a tennis player than a traveller in silk. The mayor, impressed by the august presence of the Minister of the Interior, made according to French practice a speech which he sought to render eloquent. He began by telling the married couple what presumably they knew already. He informed the bridegroom that he was the son of worthy parents and was engaged in an honourable profession. He congratulated him on entering the bonds of matrimony at an age when many young men thought only of their pleasures. He reminded the bride that her father was a hero of the Great War, whose glorious wounds had been rewarded by a concession to sell tobacco, and he told her that she had earned a decent living since her arrival in Paris in an establishment that was one of the glories of French taste and luxury. The mayor was of a literary turn, and he briefly mentioned various celebrated lovers of fiction, Romeo and Juliet, whose short but legitimate union had been interrupted by a regrettable misunderstanding, Paul and Virginia, who had met her death at sea rather than sacrifice her modesty by taking off her clothes, and finally Daphnis and Chloe, who had not consummated their marriage till it was sanctioned by the legitimate authority. He was so moving that Lizette shed a few tears. He paid a compliment to Madame Saladin, whose example and precept had preserved her young and beautiful niece from the dangers that are likely to befall a young girl alone in a great city, and finally he congratulated the happy pair on the honor that the Minister of the Interior had done them in consenting to be a witness at the ceremony. It was a testimony to their own probity that this captain of industry and eminent statesman should find time to perform a humble office to persons in their modest sphere, and it proved not only the excellence of his heart, but his lively sense of duty. His actions showed that he appreciated the importance of early marriage, affirmed the security of the family, and emphasized the desirability of producing offspring to increase the power, influence, and consequence of the fair land of France. A very good speech indeed. The wedding breakfast was held at the Château de Madrid, which had sentimental associations for Monsieur le Sieur. It has been mentioned already that among his many interests, the minister, as we must now call him, was interested in a firm of motor cars. His wedding present to the bridegroom was a very nice two-seater of his own manufacture, and in this, when lunch was over, the young couple started off for their honeymoon. This could only last over the weekend, since the young man had to get back to his work, which would take him to Marseille, Toulon, and Nice. Lizette kissed her aunt, and she kissed Monsieur le Sieur. "I shall expect you at 5 on Monday," she whispered to him. "I shall be there," he answered. They drove away, and for a moment Monsieur le Sieur and Madame Saladin looked at the smart yellow roadster. "As long as he makes her happy," sighed Madame Saladin, who was not used to champagne at lunch and felt unreasonably melancholy. "No, if he does not make her happy, he will have me to count with," said Monsieur le Sieur impressively. His car drove up. "Au revoir, chère madame. You will get a bus at the Avenue de Neuilly." He stepped into his car, and as he thought of the affairs of state that awaited his attention, he sighed with content. It was evidently much more fitting to his situation that his mistress should be, not just a little mannequin in a dressmaker's shop, but a respectable married woman.